Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by Bank of America. Bank of America has some good news to share during this trying time. They're hiring and looking to support you and your local community. Bank of America offers growth opportunities as well as the training and resources you need to create a long-lasting career, like their award-winning Academy and Financial Advisor Development programs. Bank of America is not only invested in your career, they're invested in you. Your health and safety is their number one priority. Visit careers.bofa.com/Freakonomics for your next career move. That's careers.bofa.com/Freakonomics. Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by R&T. Video chats with racing icons, car designers, Michelin star chefs, and movie directors? You bet your Zoom. Introducing R&T, a new automotive lifestyle brand by Road and Track. Join today and receive the Collector's Edition magazine, access to events, perks, promotions, and much more. To join the club and live the drive, visit roadandtrack.com/join. So what's it feel like as an economic historian to be living through a moment that's plainly historic from an economic perspective?
It is sort of mind-blowing. I remember back from the 2008 recession, I'd said to myself, well, I never thought in my life I'd live through a bank run, and here were people lining up outside banks. Now I'm living through a pandemic. It is just really hard to fathom.
That is Christina Romer.
I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley.
She is a scholar of economic catastrophe, the Great Depression in particular. She was also chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors at the start of his first term during the darkest days of the global financial crisis. She had been surprised to get that job.
And several months later, I was talking to Rahm Emanuel, the president's chief of staff, and I said, by the way, just tell me why I got this job. And he said, you were an expert on the Great Depression, and we thought we might need one.
It did take several years, but the U.S. and global economies recovered from that catastrophe, recovered pretty well at least. But now, the COVID-19 pandemic has produced an economic threat that borders on the existential.
In the first quarter this year, the GDP shrank by 4.8%.
Nearly 46 million jobless claims have been filed in the last 3 months.
Some advisors to the president are warning of unemployment numbers straight out of the Great Depression.
The Great Depression.
This is way worse than anything we saw in the Great Depression.
And so, with everything going on right now, we thought it'd be good for us to consult a Great Depression expert, if only to help us make sense of it all. Today on Freakonomics Radio, Christina Romer tells us the valuable lessons we can draw from the past.
I still feel we should have done even more.
She lists the current priorities.
It is the single biggest thing that needs to be done very quickly.
And whether we'll make it out okay on the other side.
I mean, the history of this country is rising to challenges.
From Stitcher and Dubner Productions, this is Freakonomics Radio, the podcast that explores the hidden side of everything. Here's your host, Stephen Dubner.
The National Bureau of Economic Research recently declared that the U.S. economy went into recession all the way back in February. Christina Romer sits on the committee that makes such declarations. For the past few decades, she has studied the causes and consequences of economic downturns. Why did she choose such a cheerful topic?
For an economist, there's almost nothing that matters as much in people's lives as whether they have a job, whether they can support their families. I think it probably doesn't hurt that I came of age. I was in graduate school during the Volcker recession of the early 1980s, and I think that was a searing experience for me and really made it stand out in my life.
Romer's parents were children during the Great Depression, and she saw the mark it made on them as they got older.
My mother was the most frugal person you could imagine. I can remember when my father, they were buying a house that was a little bit of a stretch. And I can remember finding my father sitting up one night just in a sweat over whether he should take on this mortgage.
If we were having this conversation at the start of 2020 with record low unemployment, record high stock markets, a generally robust economy, if we were having this conversation back then and I said, Professor Romer, I believe that real GDP in the U.S. will fall something on the order of 5 to 6% in 2020, you would have said what to me?
You're out of your mind. I can even remember having been on a phone call with one of the advisory boards that I'm on after the pandemic had started, but it was really early, and someone said, I think the unemployment rate's going to go to 11%. And even then I said, oh, for heaven's sakes, this is not the Great Recession. It's going to be a dislocation. It's going to cause problems. But how do you get to 11%?
The unemployment rate actually blew past 11%. It is worth noting that an economist as experienced as Romer, as experienced in economic catastrophes, didn't see that coming. It's also worth noting that the magnitude and volatility of this labor implosion make it even harder than usual to measure the true unemployment rate.
I mean, it always has, some problems with it. There's some particular problems because we're asking questions that we don't normally have to ask, like, are you employed but staying home because you've been exposed to the coronavirus, right? That's not a question that was ever on the survey before. And so there are certainly some problems just with how do we code those things.
How does this compare to her time in the White House during the Great Recession?
I thought in late November of 2008, wow, we're headed for a terrible downturn. Maybe the unemployment rate will go up 3 or 4 percentage points. And then the numbers start to come in and it's hitting you just, my heavens, how horrible this thing is. Both the private forecasters, those of us in government, everybody was having to readjust and say, wow, this is really bad. Oh my goodness, it's worse than really bad. And I'm sure that the people in the Treasury and the Council of Economic Advisors today are having those same kinds of moments of, holy hell, I didn't know it could get this bad.
So I guess the big question really is, how worried are you right now about the near and long-term future of the U.S. economy?
That's the million-dollar question. I'm, of course, deeply worried about the near-term outlook. I mean, what we're living through right now is truly wretched, and there aren't bad enough words to describe just how much many people are suffering. We've had a cataclysmic decline in output, a cataclysmic fall in employment. I think what worries me a lot is I think some people think, oh, we're starting to, end the lockdowns, we'll snap right back. And that, unfortunately, is not going to happen. And I think people maybe aren't prepared for the fact that this is going to be a long, hard slog. And so the pain we may have for not just a few more months, but a few more years is something that concerns me greatly.
There is growing evidence that this slog will indeed be long and hard. COVID-19 diagnoses are rising fast in many places. Many states, including Texas and Florida and California, have paused or reversed their plans to reopen the economy.
This may cause a much more permanent change in how we live and how we do things. And so we have to shut down some industries, and there's going to be some new industries that grow up. And then even for some of the same industries that we still want, the restaurants, the services, if those businesses have gone out of business, then somebody else has to come in, figure out how to do it, hire the workers, build the customer base, and that's going to take time.
So how does Romer compare the current U.S. economic damage to the Great Depression?
So we don't have quarterly data for the Great Depression, but the numbers for the first few years of the 1930s was real GDP fell at about 10% a year. And from the peak to the trough of the Great Depression, real GDP declined by about 30%. So we lost a third of our output. And when the numbers come out for the second quarter of this year, we're likely to learn that it's fallen by about 40% at an annual rate. So when we talk about a 40% annual rate, it means if we had the same behavior in the second quarter and in the next 3 quarters, GDP would be down 40%. And nobody expects that to happen. I was just looking at some numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, and they think when the dust is all settled, we'll probably say that GDP fell about 5 or 6% over all of 2020. So again, that's horrible, but when you compare it back to the Great Depression, where it was 10% a year and where it didn't happen just 1 year but 3 years, it does at least help you to realize what our grandparents lived through back in the 1930s dwarfs even what is truly a horrible time now.
As for the Great Recession, where Romer had a front row seat, real GDP fell then by about 6.3% in the fourth quarter of 2008. But apart from being a useful comparison, past recessions and depressions may also offer lessons on how to escape from this one. I asked Romer to describe what she considers the most effective parts of the Obama administration's Recovery Act.
The first thing to say is we still had a quite severe recession, and so in that sense, nobody should take a victory lap because it was really painful for lots of people. I think the one piece of the Recovery Act that has been now studied in hindsight is the aid to state and local governments. For an economist, it's a great example because some of the state and local fiscal relief in the Recovery Act was actually given more based just kind of on historical accident.
Meaning the relief was almost randomized, as if in an experiment.
And so it gave us a nice natural experiment. We can see if states that got more fiscal relief for relatively exogenous reasons did better. And the answer was they did. It was only about $140 billion. I know, only. But it seemed to have been very effective.
For instance, one analysis of Recovery Act aid found that increasing a state's Medicaid funding helped increase long-term employment. On the flip side, states and municipalities that had drastic cuts were slower to recover, often by years. In Romer's own analysis of the Great Depression, she found that federal aid to states and municipalities was very effective.
Absolutely. Before Roosevelt came in, the states were the main ones doing relief. And then as soon as Roosevelt started to have some of his public works and things like that, one of the things we see is states saying, oh, thank heavens, now we can get our fiscal house in order. So as we were designing the Recovery Act, I was one of the big proponents of we got to make sure that state and local governments don't start laying off public workers and cutting a lot of the crucial services, because that's just going to make this so much worse.
Romer thinks the same formula is important in the current crisis. State and local governments are experiencing huge drops in revenue and huge increases in spending for public services like healthcare and unemployment.
State governments are something like $750 billion in the red.
And unlike the federal government, states can't just keep borrowing and run at a deficit. They have laws requiring at least the proposal of a balanced budget.
And because they're not allowed to run budget deficits, they're going to have to start cutting spending, cutting social programs, cutting infrastructure. And that's going to be the real test of bipartisanship, because Democrats tend to be proponents of giving money to state and local governments, and Republicans often are not. And that will be the real test if we can get that through, because it is the single biggest thing that needs to be done very